I welcome you back to our third lecture. This is part of our 6th lecture series on this course. And I'm sure every month you'll be visiting, I will be allowing a new lecture to appear in Moodle. As you know, the first lecture was on basic concepts on development. Conceptualizing basic concepts on development. And it is human-centered. It is about people. And that ultimately the happiness of people is the new direction in terms of development, but differently from what it was in the beginning. In the beginning, it was a measuring and adding utilities. But now it's more on the qualitative aspects of consumption and how people are satisfied about it. And in the second lecture, we introduced the concept of globalization and human development and looked at several theories of social development, but the most important is globalization. In this lecture 3, we are going to look more closely at the impact of globalization in Africa, and more specifically, giving concrete examples of various countries, Zimbabwe and Ethiopia, Tanzania, but also countries that are in crisis. So this is not purely a Tanzanian course, but it is a course on the impact in Africa. But before we go that, this lecture is based on the work of Ahmadu Ibrahim 2013. His writing, his article is provided in Moodle, so you can go and upload it as the basic reading material for this lecture. And basically looking at what Ibrahim 2013 is discussing about the impact of globalization in Africa, but then of course we will be having our own discussions and looking at concrete examples and trying to apply that. So lecture 3 is building on lecture 2. Lecture 2 was looking at advantages and disadvantages of globalization, more globally, but of course we are looking at developed and developing countries, the North and the South, and Africa is in the South. Now we are looking more specifically in Africa. And I would expect you in answering your examinations to look at the concept of globalization and the impact of globalization in the world, and then its impact in Africa, with concrete example, but Tanzania is mandatory. The next lecture we will be looking exclusively on Tanzania, lecture 4, but lecture 3 we are looking at Africa. Now, first of all, as I said, this lecture is building on the positive and the negative aspects of globalization. And if you read Ibrahim 2013, he sees that globalization has many impacts on Africa. It impacts economically, politically, socially, and cultural relations, and the cultural relations have now become fluid and they go across boundaries, cross-boundary, inter-boundary. So there's no longer a Tanzanian, Kenyan, Rwandese culture, but we are having a global culture. Globalization, according to Ahmadu Ibrahim 2013, contributes to the breaking of barriers. And these barriers are cultural, they are commerce, and I would want you to see how culture influences commerce. Because nations cannot trade if they don't share at least some sort of a culture to engage in the global marketplace. Commerce requires some level of understanding, of communication, of medium, of language. That's why you see now, even here in the Open University, the University of Dar es Salaam, and many other universities, they are starting to teach Chinese, for example, because you need to integrate cultures in order to be more communication, etc., breaking of barriers. Now let me touch a little bit on the concept of globalization as it is being discussed by Ahmad Ibrahim 2013. It is a systematic restructuring of interactive phases among nations. So nations used to interact in the past through various ways, politically, commercially, but that is being systematically restructured by breaking down the barriers. So when we do an analysis of globalization, we have to look at what barriers are being broken down. And basically, these barriers that you see broken down are broken down because of systematic integration, because of the speed and the shrinking of the space between one country and another. They are being broken down because they are being seen as unnecessary barriers. But then, you have to be careful when you do your analysis of globalization. Ahmad Ibrahim 2013 says that globalization develops into what he calls an international community. An international community. And an international community is that which reflects dominant forces which serve specific interests. So within globalization, you have a global community called the international community. It can be countries, or it can be people with certain interests. And we'll see this as we go into the analysis. Both those who are advocating because they are disadvantaged by the globalization, and those which are advocating because they want to take their self-interest opportunities from globalization, but they develop into an international community that serves self-interests. And that is central into the analysis. Don't look at globalization purely as an issue between one country or another country, or an issue between the North and the South. It is also an issue of international movement and networks of interests. Not necessarily commercial. That's not why I'm not using the word class. It's not only economic, but a movement of people with a certain interests. And the nature of globalization, as I said earlier, is that it leads to a compression of space. You find Ahmad Ibrahim 2013 discussing this. Compression of space. The distance between Tanzania and Japan, and Tanzania and Switzerland, is now so compressed in terms of everything, financial, communication, etc., and so forth, and even in terms of interests, and in terms of time. So there is compression of space and time. As a result, the world has become one. Ultimately, Ahmad Ibrahim 2013 is that the world has become one. One big village, the global village. So just as you are in the village, everybody knows everybody else, everybody greets everybody else, everybody goes to the funeral of everybody else, information flows very quickly, the world has been compressed in space and time, such that information goes very quickly, and as a result, it has become a village. And let's look closely at the space of this village. Globalization is driven by a variety of forces, and they are all in this one village, one port. First of all, it is characterized or driven by a flow of financial and economic resources. We've heard about investments, we've heard about stock exchange. You can find there is a mine in Tanzania, but it is cross-listed in Hong Kong, in Paris, in London, and in New York. And economic and financial resources are flowing, free-flowing, and fast-flowing across the world. That drives globalization. But also a free flow and fast flow of goods and services. You can now go online and buy your phone on Amazon or on eBay, and it will be delivered by DHL to your doorstep. Goods and services at your tip. Services, the same. Financial services, but other sorts of services. You can decide to print your book internationally. You can decide to get legal services internationally very quickly, driven by technology. This is another key driver of globalization. Technology. Even our own video and Moodle is a manifestation. I don't know who is taking this course, who is listening to this lecture. For example, in the past I would have seen students in the class, but here you are watching this lecture, and you may be from Tanzania and you may be from any part of the world. But also free movement of labor. Free movement of labor. Increasingly you find cross-cultural workplaces. People working in different parts of the world and working there physically, but the home-based work, you can work home-based. So you can be working on Syria, but you are based in Dar es Salaam, or you are based in Canada or in Australia, and you do your research, you provide your outputs, you attend meetings through Skype. This is already a reality, that labor is now free-flowing. But we know that, for example, now there are certain professions in certain countries which are not that much available. For example, nurses. The health system in Malawi has suffered a lot because so many nurses have left Malawi to go and work in the national health system in United Kingdom, in Britain. So, movement of labor. But also transport is a key driver. Air traffic, and you can see now in Africa there's an increasing construction of standard gauge railways. The standard gauge railway in Kenya and Tanzania, they are now transboundary, they are now transborder. And slowly plans are being developed to build a railway from Mombasa to Lagos, from Cape to Cairo. So very soon you might find that technology in terms of transport infrastructure is really contributed to the building of. And again, the spread of culture. The spread of culture leads to a diffusion of ideas. We are not only becoming a global village, but we are becoming a global mind. There are some things which you cannot isolate yourself in terms of values, ideology, thinking, perspective, positions. They are evaluated from a global perspective. Now, having said that, let's look more at the work of Ahmadu Ibrahim 2013 and look at and discuss together what are the impacts of the globalization in Africa. First of all, there is the loss of cultural identity as a result of cultural domination from outside. So, loss of cultural identity. And what is culture? Culture is a way of life. And I don't take culture to be the way people wear their clothes, because the clothes that you wear could be a reflection of the level of development. And you move from skinny clothes to textile clothes because development has grown. So culture may not necessarily be the clothes you wear, but culture may be the values you have, the aspirations you have, the vision and mission you have, and the kind of national ideology and social values, what is regarded to be upholding cultural values, defiance and conformity. All that is being quickly transformed into. And a very good example is North Africa, Middle East. You find that the youth from North Africa and Middle East that, for example, went to the States, their fathers were working there, or mothers, or they went there on scholarship and came back, they are having completely different values. The values you can see immediately from the way they dress, the way they speak English very fluently, like an average American, but they have come back with certain values of individualism, of strong personal opinion, whether they are female or male, of challenging the age structure system, the male-dominated system, and the political establishment, and the lack of space to dialogue. That culture is the diffusion of culture, and it has also knocked its doors in Africa. There are lots of Africans in the diaspora, and their children are coming back. Probably they are staying here. They are active in social media, but social media itself, including the television, is exposing Africa to a global diffusion of culture. And the culture is, a global culture is now permeating in Africa. But also, it leads to an extinction of indigenous technology and indigenous level of technological development as a result of a dominant and more developed technologies being spread out globally. We already discussed this in chapter 1, lecture 1, on the works of Rodney and how two modes of production, when they interact with one another, the dominant one tends to underdevelop the weaker or the less developed one. And it also happens in culture. Some people have left certain, it also happens in technological development. And actually, the crisis of that befell the basic industries in Tanzania, basic industries strategy, basic industries development that were developed in Tanzania in the 1970s. Part of it is globalization. New policies of structural adjustment and free markets impacted. In the next lecture, we are going to look at one particular industry that was affected as a result of globalization. But at this point, it's fair to say that that globalization contributed to underdevelopment, or I don't want to use the word underdevelopment here. I think in my when I was preparing it, extinction of indigenous development, indigenous technological development. And we can think of a lot of ideas, of course. I've mentioned textile before, textile industries, on how the textile industries, which and evolved here, as a result of globalization, they became extinct simply because of this free flow, fast transport, fast technology, fast movement of goods and services. They declined because the other ones were further developed. You can think of more examples. We know of several companies. For example, in Tanzania, there was a company called Meko. That was a construction company on tarmac roads. Where is it now? It had reached a level of technological development, but it, because of globalization, has become extinct. The different factories and the different technology like textile, and you can think of more developments, more examples on how they were impacted. But in the next lecture, we are going to have more discussion about this. But another impact of globalization, and this is discussed by Aman Ibrahim in 2013, is development of democratic governance, consolidation of democratic governance. And this has impacted Africa, and it has reduced the capacity of government to control their policies, as well as government to control their resources. And this, in some cases, have led even to political upheaval. A country can no longer make its own policy or its own decisions. It has to calculate the global space. You have to calculate how others in that international community which I mentioned before, a community that is united to serve its self-interests and it's global in nature. You have to calculate in developing policies. And then, of course, you have dominant forces like the IMF, like the World Bank, like the G20, the G7. You have there is little space for African countries to be able to just make the policies they want. They now have to conform to certain prescriptions and to a certain mindset of that global community. And Zimbabwe is in a case in point. They had their policies to do land reforms, land redistribution, and that policy was rejected. I'm not going to go into the merits or demerits, but there was a fallout with the global community. And as a result, why I've picked Zimbabwe is that Zimbabwe moved from an economic crisis to a social crisis. And because the world is so integrated that if there is an agreement on economic policy, and in the case of Zimbabwe, this was followed by sanctions. Maybe more countries are in sanctions compared to Zimbabwe, but the sanctions are silent. But in the case of Zimbabwe, it led to international and United Nations approved sanctions. So even if one particular country that has not imposed the sanctions on Zimbabwe, if they trade with Zimbabwe, they get sanctions from the countries which have put sanctions on Zimbabwe. And therefore, we see another impact of globalization, the international sanction system, whether it is bilateral or whether it is multilateral. Because it now even reduces the ability of other countries to control their own domestic policy versus, for example, Zimbabwe in this case. Because if they decided to exercise their liberty to trade with Zimbabwe, they will also come under the list of sanctions. And as a result, an issue of economic policy culminated to an economic crisis. And the economic crisis culminated into a social crisis. As a result, no health services, no education services, no basic social services. The quality of life started to reduce, to plummet, to deteriorate, and as a result, the social crisis culminated into a political crisis. A political crisis that forced the military to remove the leadership out of power, because that became the tipping point of the political crisis. So it's important for you to see the analysis on how globalization can work across countries to influence economic policies, to trigger economic crisis, to trigger social crisis, to trigger political crisis. And Zimbabwe is a good point. It is very recent. People have started to write about Zimbabwe, and it's very good for you to familiarize yourself on what has happened in Zimbabwe and try to compare with other countries. But also, another impact of globalization in Africa is anti-developmentalism. Ahmadu Ibrahim 2013 points to this anti-developmentalism. That is, the state is increasingly becoming irrelevant and marginal as a driver in national development, at the center of the national development policy. As a result, development or economic policies are being driven in favor of certain interest groups. Certain interest groups. The donors, the multinationals, the international NGOs, and networks of NGOs become very important in deciding policy and in deciding the way services are run. Even in Tanzania, this was a big issue. Look at the health sector. You find many international NGOs working, for example, in the area of HIV, AIDS, and reproductive health. And all of them are coming in with money, they are coming in with programs, they are coming in with individual projects. They are working with the Ministry of Health, but they are working from the outside with the projects. That projects which have a beginning and implementation and which come to an end, and they are not handed over to the government, they are not coordinated, they are not synchronized with government policy, and they are handed over to government without a sustainability plan. That one is anti-developmentalism. Another anti-developmentalism agenda is whereby these dominant forces, these networks, these interest groups with certain advocacy positions may tell the government, like in the case of what we had in Tanzania, structural adjustment programs, that you cannot continue to increase your social spending because you do not have enough revenue, you don't have enough economic and financial capacity, you cannot provide free education. This is given as a conditionality. Free education, free health services, they should be stopped now. And as a result, you cannot continue to spend on higher education, you cannot continue to spend on recruitment of teachers. And you find that the mandate of the state in Africa is to promote development, is to promote a level of development that is modern. And as in the case of Tanzania and many African countries, the vision, including the African Union, the vision is to transform into semi-industrialized middle-income economies by 2030. And how do you do that without education, without basic infrastructure, without services? But you find that this network of self-interest in many African countries, and so it permeates governments and NGOs, local and international, weakening the capacity of the state to become the driver's seat of developmental policy and developmental services. As a result, it is pushed in the back. We can have an argument about this. It is an issue of debate. We have had a debate whether African countries should be operating public-private partnerships. For example, to invite private companies to do electricity generation, and then that electricity is paid by the state to procure electricity, including an important and controversial capacity charge. Capacity charge, that means you pay for the electricity whether you use it or not. This is an example on how the state is weakened. And the argument underlying this is that the state should not be involved in direct economic activities, that it should be involved in setting policy and ensuring law and order, and the private sector should be operating. I know there is a lot of merit in some of those arguments. I fully agree, and they have worked in some cases, they have not worked in other cases, and I think it's up to you as students to make an analysis. Why did PPP, for example, work in certain multinational companies like Tanzania Breweries? Tanzania Breweries was a public-private partnership, and it worked. British Petroleum and TIPA, for example, was a public-private partnership between the AGIP and the government of Tanzania, BP and the government of Tanzania. They've worked. But some have not worked, like Kamata, which was a transport company belonging to the government, like UDA, which was a public transport company for the city of Dar es Salaam, like TTCL, which was procured by Airtel, and it has now gone back to government, by Tanzania Railway Services, which was privatized to an Indian railway company from India, and it went back to government. Why did they go from government to a private PPP and then back to government? And this is something that has been impacting policies on Africa, and it seems now the African governments have been resisting that shift towards globalization. Another globalization trend is the Chinese one nation Silk Route. One nation, one road, one world, one road. Silk Route. There's a Silk Route coming from China to Rwanda. And very surprising it is, the route goes to Rwanda, but it doesn't go through Tanzania. And the same Silk Route goes all the way across India, Pakistan, to Russia. It's now on the doorsteps of Western Europe. And that is globalization. As you know, China has got these interests, which are now supported by Russia, Brazil, and South Africa. So you have to look at all these movements as with the eyes of analysis on globalization. But also, there are conflicts conflicts on distribution of resources. Conflicts of distribution of resources. How are resources being distributed as a result of economic policies that are imposed on Africa, making it unable to sustain development and economic growth? Impossible to sustain. A good example is Zimbabwe, that it came under certain interface with globalization in terms of values, and as a result, their policies were not able to sustain. Maybe you can pull South Sudan and these countries here like Central African Republic. They have got some, Congo, DRC is an example. They have so many resources, and those resources are being abused. And as a result, they are not able to be distributed fairly in the society. They are not able to sustain sustainable development. And as a result, the resources, there is conflict because people feel there's so much resources and we are not going to get anything. This was a concern with the discovery of gas in Tanzania, and it came up in the policy that there should be a sovereign fund. The fund should be getting the resources, should go to the fund, then the fund should be investing and distributing it in a sustainable manner. And it's up to you now to look at the sovereign fund and to see whether it really had inbuilt safeguards to make sure that resources that will come from gas and oil in Tanzania are well guarded to fairly distribute resources in the community in order to promote broad-based welfare policy. This is key to development studies. And not only gas that is high profile, but whatever community resources are being used, whether it is forestry, whether it is local taxation, whether it is funding that is coming to a school, is it being used in a transparent manner that is broad-based, fair, and equitable, and it is improving the welfare of the majority who are supposed to access them in agriculture, in services, in health, or is there corruption and disembezzlement? And so that was an attempt with oil and gas, the sovereign fund. Gas has not started to as a major production in terms of revenue, although some of it has started. And we have to look at how that sovereign fund. But in Africa, in most countries, there's been where resources, where there's a sudden surge of resources, there has been conflict because of the globalization in terms of what the state can do and cannot do. And therefore, the people feel that they are not, there's no equality, and therefore leading to conflict. So, another impact on Africa is that Africa has economies have increasingly become those which are open, free market, free economy, open to foreign goods and companies. And according to Ahmad Ibrahim 2013, this makes it very difficult as in Africa has sort of been stunting, not growing. And of course, this is just one example in construction. It will be up to you now to give examples on others, such as information technology. How do you develop a new Silicon Valley in Africa when everything is imported from Microsoft? And of course, even if you were to start your own office software, how would you compete with Microsoft? Because Microsoft is already a global culture, a household name, a way people interact between countries and economies. There is no more space to develop in that area. And lastly, illicit trade. Illicit trade has increased in drugs, prostitution, pornography, human smuggling, dumping of dangerous waste, and depletion of the environment. We are going to look more in the next lecture, but let me just give one example. That Africa has now become a source of domestic workers to the Middle East, with reports that the domestic workers who get there are ill-treated. The employer confiscates or takes possession of their passports, and the salaries are being withheld until they agree to separate in good terms, and some of them have been reported to be sexually molested. All these are against international rules, but because of networks and people who know each other and agents, as a result of globalization, as a result of international recruitment agencies, there is that level of globalization. And some of them find themselves as modern-day slavery. Even today here we are talking, they are slaves all over, in the UK, in the US, in the Middle East, coming from Africa and other developing countries. So Africa is being impacted because of weak institutions, poaching of natural resources, wildlife resources is one of the ways that globalization is impacted. It was there before, but now it happens at a much faster rate and intensification. Let us finish with some positive impacts. We may have sounded a bit negative, but Ahmadu Ibrahim brings out some positive impacts, and of course, I would repeat again, his article is there in Moodle, and it is an essential reading for this lecture, so I advise you to download and read it. First of all, ease of international trade and commerce has facilitated foreign investment and commerce, has facilitated greater accountability of leaders to their people. Ease of international trade and commerce. I think this speaks to itself. I don't need to, foreign investment, foreign investment has come. For example, look at the mobile phone companies. Now the majority of people in Africa own mobile phone companies. They can transfer their money through their phones. They can buy and sell through their phones. And this has contributed immensely to transfer of incomes to households that would not actually be integrated into the market. And this could not have been mobilized at this level of technology with just domestic resources. International investment has contributed to that. But that investment, because of globalization, has become more transparent. More transparent. Because everything can be seen in the internet. You can no longer just shuffle money away like the dictators of the 70s did in Africa. For example, you cannot now hide the money in the Swiss accounts. Swiss accounts, every transfer that is made has to be visible and transparent. And therefore, these leaders in Africa are more accountable and more conscious on the decisions they do. Contracts, agreements with multinational companies, everything is in the open. You can get it very quickly. But also, globalization has promoted general acceptable principles of democratic governance. Good governance. Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights, most of African countries have now integrated the Bill of Rights, which was in the US Constitution, in constitutions across the continent. And therefore, there are certain rights every individual citizen has against the state that are fundamental, and they are in the Constitution. And that is an example. And even the African Union itself has a charter of peoples and human rights and has the Bill of Rights. And elections are also open. Much as Africa has still got room to grow in electoral democracy, but they are now open to international observers. So everyone is observing every other's elections and writing a report and making opinions. And in most of the countries now, the results of elections, general elections, are contestable in court, including Zimbabwe. In Tanzania, they are contestable in court except for the presidential. However, there was a lot of debate on this in the constitution that was being recommended, and the process that is yet to be completed. But elections have become much more of an international issue, not just a local international issue. And economic policies and etc. And the International Criminal Court, ICC. So the rights violated anywhere are rights that can be enforced everywhere in the world. And the International Criminal Court, we know the case of Kenya, where a sitting president was received a summons, the legal word indicted, to appear, and his case was listened, and because of lack of evidence, he was acquitted. And that's quite a serious level of development. And warlords and people who commit high crimes like genocide, the International Court of Rwanda, and now the African Union has its own international court, and therefore that is part of globalization. And in a very interesting development, Gambia, for example, went to the international court and complained against Myanmar for violating the rights of its minorities. And the leadership of that country had to go and make arguments in the international court. So that is globalization. That's globalization. And remember the community of interests, people who have self or similar interests. But an emergency of an international lobby and pressure groups in various fields. There are international lobby and pressure groups in environment, climate change, in the rights of sexual minorities, in the rights of children, in the international women movement, and these are global in nature. They are pressure groups that are united and they network and they are active and they have systems, and therefore they promote human development and they promote their work. But it also opens people's lives to other cultures, and the creativity from one culture flows to another. And an example of this is the Kaizen approach that is being promoted systematically by Japan as values that entrepreneurs, if they have the values of the Kaizen, they, entrepreneurs, can be able to develop. as the Japanese have, because the Japanese people have a certain philosophy and a certain culture called the Kaizen approach. It is now integrated in the Ministry of Industries and Trade, and it is being taught. Again, ICT has made it easier for people to interact. An example of this class, but also Skype. Skype, I can have a Skype meeting with Switzerland, and I can combine Switzerland, Kenya, Gambia, and USA. In real time, we are holding a meeting, and and then information about how countries are governed also spreads as a positive thing, and it has opened up African countries to intense external scrutiny. So Africa is because of globalization, the flow of information, and all the factors above, there is close monitoring about what is happening in Africa by the global community. And thank you very much. That is all for this lecture.